In conversation with her oldest grandchild, Zach, she talked about the issues she cared about, the issues for which she'd fought over 3 decades in Congress, a strong middle class woman's right to choose, the environment, civil rights, human rights, and underscored that she wasn't going to give them up. But as she told Zach, she wanted to come home to California, and so she wouldn't be running for re-election. November 2016 was almost 2 years away, but I had a decision to make. Should I run to replace Senator Boxer? It would be an opportunity to take the issues we were driving forward in the California Attorney General's office and bring them to the national stage. Becoming the U.S. Senator would be a natural extension of the work I was already doing, fighting for families, feeling the burden of stagnant wages, soaring housing costs, and diminishing opportunity, for people in prison in a broken criminal justice system, for students exploited by predatory lenders and burdened by skyrocketing tuition, for victims of fraud and white-collar crime, for immigrant communities, for women, for older people. I knew it mattered whose voice is represented at the table where national priorities and policies are set. I announced my candidacy on January 13, 2015. Eventually, so did 33 others. Doug, for whom it was his first major campaign, had to get used to a new kind of scrutiny. We still laugh about the time a reporter asked me who would play me in a movie about my life. I deflected, said I didn't know. Doug was not as prudent. He answered the question, and the resulting article said he was delighted at the prospect of being played by Bradley Cooper. I tackled the races I had every other, meeting as many people as I could. Listening carefully to their concerns, mapping a plan of action to address them. As the campaign rolled on, my team and I crisscrossed the state in what we called the Kamoji bus, because of the giant emoji caricature of me painted on the back door. Because of California's unique jungle primary, I ultimately found myself in a runoff against fellow Democrat Loretta Sanchez, a longtime member of Congress. She was a tough, determined opponent who kept fighting until the end. I was fortunate enough to have on my team some of the best people in the business. My brilliant campaign manager, Juan Rodriguez, and my longtime strategic advisor, Sean Clegg and A. Smith, along with Ellie Capel, and an extraordinary dedicated group of staff and volunteers. My goddaughter, Helena, was among them. She started a newsletter interviewing the staff and chronicling our efforts. Our team was in it together every step of the way, and I couldn't have done it without them. The 2-year campaign passed both fast and slow. But even as I focused on my state, my campaign, and the work before me, something ugly and alarming was infecting the presidential election. The Republican primary was turning into a race to the bottom, a race to anger, a race to blame, a race to fan the flames of xenophobic nativism. And the man who prevailed crossed every boundary of decency and integrity, bragging about sexually assaulting women, mocking people with disabilities, race baiting, demonizing immigrants, attacking war heroes and Gold Star families, and fomenting hostility, even hatred toward the press. As a result, election night 2016 was not a night for cheering. It was no longer about the race that had just ended. It was about the fight that was clearly not beginning. Drawing on the words of Coretta Scott King, I reminded the audience that freedom must be fought for and won by every generation. It is the very nature of this fight for civil rights and justice and equality that whatever gains we make, they will not be permanent. So we must be vigilant, I said. Understanding that, do not despair, do not be overwhelmed. Do not throw up our hands when it is time to roll up our sleeves and fight for who we are. I didn't know when I spoke to my supporters that night exactly what was to come, but I did know this. We would need to stand strong and stand together. On Thursday, November 10th, less than 48 hours after my election, I visited the headquarters of the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles. CHIRLA is one of Los Angeles' oldest immigrant rights advocacy organizations. It was founded in 1986 after President Reagan, a former California governor, signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which, among other things, gave legal status to undocumented immigrants who had entered the United States before 1982. CHIRLA's original mission was to inform immigrants about the process by which they could apply for legal status and about their rights to work. It trained community organizers, challenged anti-immigrant laws like California's Proposition 187, which prohibited undocumented immigrants from getting non-emergency public services, and it eventually took in a national portfolio by building coalitions all across the country. It was the first place I wanted to speak officially as a senator-elect. Angela Salas, CHIRLA's indefatigable executive director, was there to greet me when I arrived. The room was full. It was full of strong, brave women, young women and mothers, to grandmothers to great-grandmothers, working women who did everything from domestic work to home health care work. Some of whom spoke fluent English and some of whom spoke only Spanish, all of them ready to fight. And their courage, their dignity, and their determination, they reminded me of my mother. Standing among them, I thought about the duality of the immigrant experience in America. On the one hand, it is an experience characterized by an extraordinary sense of hopefulness and purpose, a deep belief in the power of the American dream, an experience of possibility. At the same time, it's an experience too often scarred by stereotyping and scapegoating, in which discrimination, both explicit and implicit, is part of everyday life. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known, but I always felt protective of her too. In part, I suppose that instinct to protect comes from being the older child, but I also knew my mother was a target. I saw it and it made me mad. I have too many memories of my brilliant mother being treated as though she were dumb because of her accent, memories of her being followed around a department store with suspicion because surely a brown-skinned woman like her couldn't afford the dress or blouse that she'd chosen. I also remember how seriously she took any encounter with government officials, whenever we would come back from traveling abroad, my mother made sure Maya and I were on our best behavior as we went through customs. Stand up straight, don't laugh, don't fidget, have all your stuff prepared. She knew that every word she spoke would be judged, and she wanted us to be ready. The first time Doug and I went through customs together, my muscle memory kicked in. I was preparing myself in the usual way, making sure we had everything just right and in order. Meanwhile, Doug was relaxed as ever. It frustrated me that he was so casual. He was genuinely perplexed, innocently wondering what's the problem. We'd been raised in different realities. It was eye-opening for us both. For as long as ours had been a nation of immigrants, we had been a nation that fears immigrants. Fear of the other is woven into the fabric of our American culture, and unscrupulous people in power have exploited that fear in pursuit of political advantage. In the mid-1850s, the first significant third-party movement in the United States, the so-called Know Nothing Party, rose to popularity on an anti-immigrant platform. In 1882, an act of Congress banned Chinese immigrants to the country. In 1917, Congress overrode President Woodrow Wilson's veto in order to establish a host of new restrictions on immigrants, including a literacy requirement. Concerns about growing numbers of newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe resulted in the imposition of immigrant quotas in 1924. In 1939, nearly 1,000 German Jews fleeing the Nazis in a ship called the St. Louis were turned away from the United States. A plan to allow 20,000 Jewish children into the country was outright rejected. And shortly after, the U.S. government interned some 117,000 people of Japanese ancestry. More recently, as globalization has robbed the country of millions of jobs and displaced huge swaths of the middle class, immigrants have become convenient targets for blame. When the Great Recession ravaged rural America, a number of Republican politicians pointed to immigration as the problem, even as they filibustered a bill that would have created new jobs. Despite the profound role they have played in building and shaping America, immigrants who come here to seek a better life have always made for an easy scapegoat. Our country was built by many hands, by people from every part of the world. And over the centuries, immigrants have helped to lift and fuel the economy, providing labor to industrialize it and brain power to create society-altering innovations. Immigrants and their children were the creative minds behind many of our best-known brands, from Levi Strauss to Estee Lauder. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, was a Russian immigrant. Jerry Yang, co-founder of Yahoo, came from Taiwan. Mike Krieger, the co-founder of Instagram, is an immigrant from Brazil. Ariana Huffington, co-founder of the Huffington Post, was born in Greece. In fact, in 2016, researchers of the National Foundation for American Policy found that more than half of Silicon Valley's billion-dollar startups were founded by one or more immigrants. I stood by the Pony Inn in Charlotte with an American flag and stars and stripes balloons in the backdrop as a mother, a house cleaner from the San Fernando Valley, spoke in Spanish about her fears of deportation. I could barely translate her words, but I understood their meaning and I could feel her anguish. It was visible in her eyes and her posture. She wanted to be able to tell her children that everything would be okay, but she knew she couldn't. I thought then of the nearly 6 million American children who live in a home with at least one undocumented family member and the trauma and stress that the election had wrought. I had heard many stories of safety plans that were being put in place, mothers telling their children, if mommy doesn't come home right after work, call your aunt or uncle to come and get you. It reminded me of the safety plans I'd seen when I was working with victims of domestic abuse. In both cases, there needed to be a contingency plan to mitigate against an impending harm. Advocates working with families told us how children were afraid to go to school, not knowing if their parents would still be there when they got home. Parents canceled their children's pediatrician appointments out of fear that ICE would be waiting for them. Likewise, I knew the parents at that moment were facing harrowing decisions about what to do with their American children if they were deported. Should the children stay with a relative in the United States? Should they go with their parents to a country they had never known? Either option was heartbreaking to imagine. And I knew it wasn't just undocumented people who were terrified. According to research published in American behavioral scientists, all Latinx immigrants, whether citizens, legal residents, or undocumented, experience the fear of deportation at the same rates. I wanted them to know I had their back. This is a time in our country for coalition building, I said, reminded of the work I had seen and done through the years. We are going to fight for the ideals of this country, I told them, and we are not going to let up until we have won. I left Charlotte 2 days after the election feeling both encouraged and worried. I knew we were praying for battle together, but I knew too that we were underdogs in the fight. We were going to have to steel ourselves for all that was to come. Things moved very quickly. The following week, Doug and I flew across the country to Washington for our new senator's orientation. A bipartisan group of senators and their spouses hosted us for 3 jam-packed days of sessions, during which we were informed about Senate rules and procedures, ethics, and how to set up a Senate office. Doug studied the spouse's binder like a Talmudic scholar. Nathan Barrican, my number 2 in the California Department of Justice, agreed to move his family to Washington, and he began the intensive process of selecting and vetting my new team as my chief of staff. We had only the period between Election Day and New Year's to build the office virtually from scratch, poring over some 5,000 resumes to fill a host of positions from policy and constituent relations to communications correspondence and more. Hiring a diverse staff was important to me, veterans, women, people of color. I wanted my staff in Washington and our state officials to reflect the people we represent. Ella was now in her senior year of high school, which meant that Doug would be spending at least every other week in Los Angeles. This was the hardest part of it all, being away from Ella. Before becoming a senator, I had gone to every one of her swim meets, every one of her basketball games. Kirsten and I usually embarrassed Ella as we sat together and loudly cheered her name. I hated that I would have to miss some of those games now. And I hated that we would have so much less quality time in person, especially because she was about to go off to college, as Cole had done several years earlier. I was committed to flying home as many weekends as I could, which is important to me for so many reasons: to see my constituents, feel the pulse on the ground, and crucially cook Sunday family dinner. The worst was several months later when I realized I wasn't going to be able to go to Ella's graduation. Fired FBI Director James Comey had been invited to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee that same day about the Russian investigation and his firing, and given the significance to our national security, there was no way I could miss it. When I called to tell her, she was so understanding, but I felt awful about it. I had conversations with some of my female colleagues afterwards. Maggie Hassan bucked me up. Our kids love us for who we are and the sacrifices we make, she said. They get it. In the case of Ella and Cole, I'm so lucky to know that's true. When the hearing was over, I dashed to the airport and flew back to California. I missed the graduation ceremony, but made it home in time for family dinner that night. Doug and I rented a temporary apartment not far from the Capitol, along with minimal furniture. pair of stools, a bed, a fold-out couch for when the kids came to visit, and for Doug, a big screen TV. With things happening so quickly, there wasn't much time on the margins for grocery shopping, or cooking. Though I did make turkey chili one night and froze enough to last us for weeks. I was sworn in on January 3rd, 2017 by Vice President Joe Biden during his final month in office, and moved into a basement office alongside other newly elected senators. While not every Senate committee had available seats, I was appointed to 4 based on my expertise and background: Intelligence, Homeland Security, Budget, and Environment and Public Works. 1 week later, the Homeland Security Committee held a confirmation hearing for General John Kelly, who had been nominated for Secretary of Homeland Security. I chose to focus my questions to him on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA, which was created in 2012 by the Obama administration to protect eligible undocumented youth from deportation and allow them to obtain work permits. Hundreds of thousands of DACA recipients around the country are afraid Recipients had submitted extensive paperwork to the federal government, including detailed information about themselves and their loved ones. Each person's case was reviewed and vetted according to specific criteria. The young person must not have been convicted of a felony, a significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more misdemeanors. They must not have been deemed a threat to public safety or national security. They had to be in school or have already earned a high school diploma or certificate, or have been honorably discharged from the armed forces. They had to provide proof of identity, proof of time and admission in the United States, proof of school completion or military status, and biometric information. Only if they cleared this extensive vetting would they get DACA status. In addition, when they applied, the Department of Homeland Security assured them it would follow its long-standing practice not to use their information for law enforcement purposes except in very limited circumstances. These young people, I said to General Kelly, are now worried that the information they provided in good faith to our government may not be used to track them down and lead to their removal. Hundreds of thousands of them have relied on our representations. Do you agree that we would not use this information against them, I asked. Kelly wouldn't directly answer the question. I next read to him from the government document, frequently asked questions about DACA program. It was a question to ask: if my case is referred to ICE, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, for immigration enforcement purposes, or if I receive an NTA, notice to appear, will information related to my family members and guardians also be referred to ICE for immigration enforcement purposes? The answer to the question on the government document was no. Are you willing to maintain that policy, I asked. Again, Kelly deflected. I pressed harder. Do you intend to use the limited law enforcement resources of DHS to remove DACA recipients from the country? Once again, he refused to answer the question directly. Would you agree that state and local law enforcement agencies are uniquely situated to protect the public safety of their own communities? I would agree, he said. Are you aware that state and local law enforcement leaders across the country have publicly stated that they depend on the cooperation of immigrant communities to prosecute criminal activity and come forward as witnesses of crime? I've read that. And are you aware that when the government has applied indiscriminate immigration sweeps, many local law enforcement agencies have been concerned and have complained that there has been a decrease in immigrants reporting crimes against themselves and others? I was not aware of that. Will you make it your priority to become aware of the impact on immigrant communities in terms of their reluctance to report crimes against themselves, their family members, or others when they are concerned that DHS might direct sweeps against entire immigrant communities? You have my commitment. I'll get briefed on this. Again, I fall back on really the law will guide me, if confirmed, in everything that I do. That wasn't enough. As a former district attorney and attorney general, I had a lot of experience with this issue. I knew the victims of crime, be it rape, be it child sexual assault, be it fraud, simply will not come forward if they believe they're the ones who will be treated as criminals. I also knew that predators use this knowledge to their advantage, exploiting the vulnerability of certain groups they know will keep quiet. I don't ever want a victim of a crime to be afraid to wave down a passing patrol car to get help. Such a system serves the predators, not the public. It renders all of us less safe. As Attorney General, I had crafted legislation to help ensure that undocumented immigrants who step forward and testify about crimes or to report them were shielded from deportation for doing so. I knew this would help prosecutors obtain convictions while strengthening relationships of trust between law enforcement and immigrant communities. In the end, I voted against John Kelly's confirmation and pressed my colleagues to do the same. He wasn't prepared to keep the nation's promises, and I wasn't prepared to put him in charge of them. Whether he ever got briefed on the consequences of indiscriminate immigration enforcement, I will never know. What I do know is that in the first 100 days of the administration, immigration arrests increased by more than 37%. The administration chose to make all unauthorized immigrants a priority for deportation, regardless of whether they were otherwise law-abiding members of the community. Arrests of undocumented immigrants with no criminal record nearly double. The policies have had far-reaching consequences for children. As the Center for American Progress documented, ICE officials raided a meatpacking plant in Tennessee where they arrested 97 workers. It was one of the largest workplace raids in 10 years. All told, 160 children had a parent arrested in the raid. The next day, 20% of the Latinx students in a nearby country were absent from school as parents feared that they or their children would be arrested as well. In 2016, a quarter of all kids in the United States under the age of 5 lived in immigrant families. These children have had to live in the grip of fear that at any moment their parents could be abruptly taken away from them. Children of immigrants also face a new kind of torment. Teachers around the country reported spikes of bullying that echoed the administration's rhetoric. Kids are being taunted by other kids, told they will be deported, told their parents will be deported, told they should go back to where they came from. The words of our one prominent, powerful bully have been mimicked and adopted as a rallying cry of bullies everywhere. Of course, it's not just the children of immigrants who are affected. According to the Migration Policy Institute, for example, at least 20% of early childhood educators are immigrants. Immigrants also represent a large percentage of people working in the early child care industry. And those numbers have have tripled over the past 2 decades. These caregivers, primarily women, nurture millions of children each and every day. The risk to their safety and security in this country due to overbroad immigration enforcement are a risk to us all. This cannot be overlooked. On January 20th, 2017, I attended the presidential inauguration along with fellow members of the United States Congress. My Senate colleagues and I gathered in the Senate chamber and walked 2 by 2 through the Capitol building, exiting the west front onto the inaugural platform, where risers and chairs were arrayed for the ceremony. As we walked to our seats, we were handed plastic ponchos in case of rain. Doug was sitting with his new pals in the spouses section closer to the stage than I was. He turned around and gave me a wave. By some twist of fate, the skies opened up just as the transition of power was complete. Some supporters of the president took the reign as a sign of blessing, but for me and so many others, dark clouds were settling in. Renewal, it turned out, decided to reveal itself the next day. In the run-up to Inauguration Day, activists had planned a women's march in cities all across the country, but given their organic, decentralized way the march had come together, sparked by a Facebook post from a grandmother in Hawaii the day after the election and organized in a matter of weeks by a diverse group of activists, many of whom had never met before, no one knew exactly how it would unfold. Reality exceeded all expectations. More than 4 million people showed up in the streets nationwide with sister marches in countries around the world. In Washington, the crowd was so massive that it packed the entire route, end to end, a vibrant sea of pink-headed people of all ages, races, genders, and orientations. Marchers carried handmade signs that expressed the full range of emotions we all felt, from disbelief to determination, horror, purpose, and hope. It's 2017. WTF. Still I rise. Girls just want to have fundamental rights. Men of quality don't fear equality. We the people. I saw white-haired grandmothers and blue-haired college students, flannel-clad hipsters and down-jacketed soccer moms, toddlers and strollers and teenagers in the trees, men and women in solidarity side by side. Amazingly, amid the throng, I ran to Aunt Lenore, who engulfed me in a giant bear hug. She told me that her daughter, Lila, who was at the time a leader in the Service Employees International Union, was in the crowd as well. They had come out to march together, carrying forward the banner of social justice that Lenore and my mother had held high as students at Berkeley half a century before. I had been asked to speak, and as I climbed up to the stage, I was overwhelmed by the size and spirit of the crowd stretching out before me as far as I could see. There were so many people that cellular networks had gone down, yet the energy was electric. No one could move, but everyone seemed to understand that the march was a glimpse of a new kind of coalition, whose true strength had yet to be tested. Even if you're not sitting in the White House, even if you're not a member of the United States Congress, even if you don't run a big corporate super PAC, you have the power. And we the people have the power, I told the marchers. And there is nothing more powerful than a group of determined sisters marching alongside with their partners and determined sons and brothers and fathers, standing up for what we know is right. I talked about women's issues, at least what I see as women's issues: the economy, national security, healthcare, education, criminal justice reform, climate change. I said that if you were a woman who is an immigrant and you don't want your family torn apart, you know that immigration reform is a women's issue. I said that if you are a woman who is working off student loans, you know that the crushing burden of student debt is a women's issue. I said that if you were a black mother trying to raise a son, you know that Black Lives Matter is a woman's issue. And if you're a woman, period, you know we deserve a country with equal pay and access to health care, including a safe and legal abortion, protected as a fundamental and constitutional right. I affirmed that together we're powerful and cannot be written off. A few days later, Doug and I were in our new apartment in D.C. eating dinner on stools at our kitchen counter when breaking news cut across the television. The president signed an executive order banning travel to the United States from 7 Muslim-majority countries: Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, for a period of 90 days. He barred refugees from coming to the United States for 120 days and barred refugees from Syria indefinitely. Travelers started getting detained at airports, unable to speak with lawyers. Families were panicking as their loved ones failed to emerge from airport security. I received calls from activists and lawyers, including Mina, who had rushed to airports to try to help people who were being detained. There was chaos, so I called John Kelly. By then, he had been confirmed as Secretary of Homeland Security, and I needed to find out what was going on and to make sure that anyone being detained would get access to a lawyer. There were a lot of ways Secretary Kelly could have shown his responsiveness, a lot of information he could have provided. Indeed, the American people had a right to this information, and given my oversight role on the Senate Homeland Security Committee, I intended to get it. Instead, he said gruffly, "Why are you calling me at home with this?" That was his chief concern. By the time we got off the phone, it was clear that he didn't understand the depth of what was going on. He said he'd get back to me, but he never did. And by the next day, the nation had erupted in spontaneous protest, knowing full well that the travel ban was really a Muslim ban, and that there were a few things more anti-ethical to our founding ideals, antithetical to our founding ideals. Enshrined in the First Amendment is the notion not only would America establish no official religion of its own, but the government has no authority to prohibit anyone's activities based on their religion. I was new to Washington and still learning how things worked. This episode taught me that calling the Secretary of Homeland Security was a wasted effort. We needed a law. The first bill I introduced in the Senate was the Access to Counsel Act, which prohibits federal officials from denying access to a lawyer for anyone detained trying to reach the United States. But we were in an uphill fight, made harder by the political circumstances of the moment. 4 days after the travel ban was executed, Neil Gorsuch was nominated to the Supreme Court to fill a seat that had been open since Antonin Scalia's death was a year earlier. President Obama had nominated a highly respected United States Circuit Judge, Merrick Garland, to serve. But in an unprecedented show of partisan obstruction, Republicans refused to hold even one hearing on Garland's nomination. They were rewarded for their recalcitrance. Gorsuch was confirmed by the Senate in April 2017, shifting the balance of power in the court back toward the conservative justices. 15 months later, Justice Gorsuch cast the deciding vote in one of the most shameful decisions in the court's recent history, the decision to uphold the president's travel ban.